What's that? Okay, that's perfect. Trisha, you know how to do live. Oh wait, here. Guess it.
No, don't. Once you turn it, it won't change.
Okay. For some reason, it wants to be like this. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jordan DeGraff. I'm the founder and president of CY Christ, and we're celebrating National Crime Victims' Rights Week. And over there, for those of you joining us on YouTube and Facebook, you see our presenters today. We're having a roundtable discussion on human trafficking and the importance of housing for victims of human trafficking. And so we're going to go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to ask the presenters to introduce themselves. And we'll start with you, Shelley.
Hi, my name is Shelley Rep. I'm the Executive Director of the New Mexico Dream Center.
Hi, I'm Morgan Langer. I'm a group supervisor with Homeland Security Investigations. I supervise the group that oversees human trafficking investigations.
And I'm Heather Astley. I'm a victim advocate with the Lifelink located here in New Mexico.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it. And we're going to go through several questions in the audience. You can ask questions too if you're joining us via the Zoom webinar. You can type in the Q&A and we'll save some time at the end for some of those questions. But we're going to go ahead and get started. Heather, the first question is for you. Would you tell us a little bit more about what the Lifelink does?
So the Lifelink is a behavioral health facility located in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The specific program that I work for is a human trafficking aftercare program. We provide wraparound services to victims who are referred to as either by law enforcement, other service providers, and sometimes who are self-reported. We offer transitional housing, which is short-term until we can get them to long-term housing through other service providers throughout the state. We're located in Santa Fe, but we cater to the whole state of New Mexico. I work really close with Shelley and Morgan on some of the cases that we get. And we ultimately just help individuals kind of build their lives and start thriving as, independency.
Awesome. Do I get to go next, Jordan?
Yes, go ahead.
Awesome. Sorry, I just jumped the gun because I'm so excited to be
No,
here.
you're good.
I know, sorry.
Go
This
for
is
it.
why I'm not in the middle, because who knows what will happen. So the New Mexico Dream Center provides some very similar services as Lifelink. In fact, when we first got started in 2018, a lot of what we learned was because we had such a close connection to the Lifelink. We also do provide aftercare with a wraparound case management program and model. We work really, really closely with our clients on something that we would call a pro-social model to help them understand how they can be within community safely. We have an emergency shelter and transitional living, and then, as Heather said, really do work with service providers to be able to get clients housed safely, independently around the state of New Mexico. Kind of the slice that's a little bit different with us is we really try to focus on youth and transitional age. And so by default, Lifelink also obviously works with this population, but we've tried to really make sure our services are responsive for that age demographic. Part of that means that we do have a drop-in center, which is a resource center for youth experiencing homelessness, basically for age 21 years old and under. And this is a walk-up service, so those young people can come to our facility and they can get food, take showers, connect with the case manager, get clothing, those kinds of services. The last thing that we do when it comes to those in-person types of services is that we have a really robust outreach program. So we do outreach about 4 days a week, looking to interact with our target population and assist them with providing services there within the outreach environment, as well as steering them towards our drop-in center.
Wonderful. And Morgan, would you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what you do?
So I supervise a group of about 13 people, different job titles. 7 of the people I supervise are special agents. I have one agent that's dedicated to human trafficking investigations. That includes both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We have a pretty robust human trafficking program here in northern New Mexico, and we work very closely with both of these groups, the Mexico Dream Center and Lifelink, in victim recovery, victim rescue, and victim stability to get them through the criminal cases if we have one.
Thank you, Morgan. And we're going to get right into like where this whole process began. So, Morgan, would you tell us what situation you usually find victims of human trafficking in?
Yeah, so we come across victims or survivors of human trafficking in a variety of situations. Sometimes we'll run proactive law enforcement operations where we encounter them. Sometimes they're referred to us maybe by another law enforcement agency or by a nonprofit. Sometimes they're referred to us self-reporting, like Heather mentioned. Typically, we find them when we find them kind of recovered from like a law enforcement operation. They're usually in a very traumatic, very dire situation. They're oftentimes homeless, living in a hotel. They're often addicted to drugs. We find many addicted to methamphetamine or heroin. They're in varying states of medical distress. A lot of them have existing medical conditions that haven't been treated. They have psychological trauma. They don't have any basic necessities. They don't have access to food. They don't have access to housing, shelter, clothing, hygiene products. The traffickers take all their money, so they don't have any money. They're a very desperate situation that they literally have the clothes on their back, which is usually not much. So that's kind of how we usually find the victims or the survivors.
So how important do you think partnerships with nonprofits are?
I say this every time I do one of these, and these ladies are probably sick of hearing, but without them, we couldn't do our cases. We rescue, recover the victims, but without nonprofits, we have nowhere to house them. We have no one to provide them with basic necessities, no one to provide them with the mental health counseling, the substance abuse counseling that they need. The nonprofits take the survivors and victims off our hands because as law enforcement, we're not equipped or able to deal with them on any type of long-term basis. So we stay involved in like more of a security standpoint, or if they need to be moved to like a different state because of security reasons, we'll stay involved with that. But without these two groups and other groups like them, literally not one human trafficking successful prosecution would ever be conducted, not just here, but anywhere in the United States.
Thank you, Morgan. That answered the next question. And so I'm going to ask Shelly or Heather, whichever one wants to answer first or jump in. What is the first steps that your organization takes to help victims?
Heather, I'm going to let you go ahead and you can go, and I'll follow up if there's any gaps.
Okay, so I've been a first responder when Morgan gives us a call if they do get a victim. I usually will go out, meet Morgan, and kind of talk with the victim a little bit. Sometimes, more often than not, they don't really want services at that time. Again, it's usually due to their trauma. They're trying to leave the location or situation, and they don't really want to talk about, getting services with us. So we kind of just make contact first, and then we kind of give out our information, tell them what our program can offer them, and if it's something that they're interested in, and it usually happens like a day or two after, they usually reach out to us, and then we do a small assessment of what they're needing. Again, they're more usually homeless, so we try to look for emergency shelter, which might be our safe house, which is located in Santa Fe, or here in Albuquerque. Depending on their level of security, like Morgan is saying, we don't know whether or not they're still in touch with their trafficker. So we kind of have, that communication with law enforcement. So it really depends on the level of security of whether or not it's appropriate to keep them around the same area or to move them to Santa Fe or another location. So once we establish that, we're able to get them hygiene products, a little bit of clothing, some food, and we're able to house them until we can get them into their own independent housing. The mental health piece, we do assess them to see where their trauma is at. Sometimes it's really hard to leave them alone, only because they usually have other individuals come stay with them who may not be appropriate to be there at that time. So we kind of assess that, and if there's any kind of medical conditions to where they need to be sent to either an urgent care or go through the ER, we help them transport them and kind of sit with them and get everything that's assessed. And it can include anywhere between, taking care of the consequences of utilizing drugs, or it could be medication that they just needed to be on for behavioral health reasons. But that's usually the first steps that we take. And then it goes into kind of getting them to a position to where they can kind of advocate for themselves as far as getting benefits from the state, which is, food stamps, general assistance because they're entitled to that, and health insurance. And so those are kind of the basics that we do first, and then we kind of go along and see where everybody's at once we kind of establish whether or not they want to stay here or if they're wanting to relocate. So that's usually it.
Yeah, Heather, you're exactly right. I think in looking at this, kind of to summarize that, is that what you're really doing when you first interact with a survivor is trying to start building a relationship. And so start building just these pathways of trust, so they feel like they can find someone that they can reach out to. And it's really important that you give them that choice. Oftentimes especially if they're in a law enforcement operation, upon identification, that can be just super stressful right there in itself. And a lot of times they're going to feel like they are the one that is in trouble. And so as you're working with them, kind of building those things of trust. Heather, I know that you're probably like this too. One of the first things that I find is food, like getting them the kind of food they want, which is not carrots and celery. It's going to Sonic and getting the biggest size, drink you can get, and, that type of fast food. And when you do that, you're allowed to have conversations. So you're allowed to build those little bits of trust here and there, so that when they are ready to start taking some of these steps, they know that they can contact you and that they'll be heard. And so that's all I was going to say, because everything Heather says is exactly right. And the whole process is this is how you build trust, so that they can learn how to take those steps.
Thank you both. Then would you go into how important is accessibility to housing for victims?
So we would say, I'll start with this one and then
Okay.
you jump in.
Yeah.
We'll just go back and forth over Morgan like this.
That's perfect. Morgan, you can
That's how it
go.
usually works.
Sorry.
Morgan,
We'll
you
let
can
you
jump
talk
in
again.
too whenever you want to.
So I would say accessibility to housing, to shelter, to something safe is huge. It is huge. It is huge. It is huge. What we have to understand is, by the very nature of their victimization, a human trafficking victim is homeless. So they don't have a place where they can go and they can necessarily be safe. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have a place to stay, because they could be in a hotel, or they could be in an apartment, or they could be in a home, something like that. But they don't have a place where they get to feel like they can make the decisions around their care and around whatever their next steps are. So being able to have that kind of accessibility is a huge, huge piece. What we found with that is they want that, but then, as Heather, you mentioned before, they're also kind of afraid. And so they feel like they need to have a support person with them as well. So kind of understanding that process and what that looks like is really, really important for helping them. I think with anybody, when you are feeling vulnerable and you don't know what your life is going to look like for the next couple days or the next couple of weeks, feeling like you've got a home base, that you've got someplace you can go to and be safe, is going to be a huge, huge load off of your shoulders. And so that's why we look at this housing piece as being vital to the effective care of a human trafficking victim.
No, that's absolutely right. Housing is probably the biggest stability that anybody can have, and having access to that, is very important for anybody. But allowing them to understand that, that it is a place that they can be safe at. I see a lot of people who come into our safe house who think that they're going to be there for a long time. It's only short time. It's, anywhere from a couple days to a month is usually the standardized stay. Because it's not meant to be used for a long-term, living situation. And so having to be proactive and reminding them that, we're looking for housing, look for housing, this is the budget. And it's really hard to even have them perceive that they're looking for our home to be in. So, it's a lot of skill building and a lot of communication and just building that rapport.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And what is the first step that your organizations take in finding temporary housing?
Well, for the Lifelink, we do have a couple of safe houses located here in New Mexico. But if those aren't options, we've been able to build relationships with a few hotels who will take our clients up to a week. And then we utilize some resources like First Nations, who's able to have somebody put in a hotel or a room that they have a relationship with, and allow them to stay there until we can figure something out. But those are usually our options. We kind of look for our resources versus having to tap into other funding programs. But Crime Victims Reparation has been great at helping our organizations. We have a very close relationship with them. We're able to get, funding for these individuals to either be put, again, in a hotel room or in a safe house. I haven't really utilized any of the shelters, the big shelters here in Albuquerque or in Santa Fe, only because the level of trauma that these individuals have, they're not able to function in that kind of setting, and they more often will get re-victimized.
I agree. In fact, we really try not to put a client into a shelter if at all possible. Similarly, as the Lifelink, New Mexico Dream Center kind of has a step-up process with that. So initially with us, we do have what we call our emergency shelter, which is up to 7 days that somebody can come into. The reason we offer it like that is there's not a whole lot of rules with those first 7 days. I mean, there's some rules around safety, and there's some rules where, you can't go invite all your friends over to the shelter, our emergency shelter, that kind of thing. But what it does is it kind of allows a survivor to come into a safe place, understand what it means to be in a safe place, and really have them decide if they're willing to go into the next steps for our program. And so within that 5 to 7 days that they're in the shelter, if they decide that they want to take those next steps and come into formalized programming with us, then that's where we go. They can choose at any time during the shelter stay to leave. There's not anything that's going to hold them there. When they come to the next phase for us, we call that our transitional living program. And so that program is a 12-year, oh my gosh, could you imagine?
I wish.
12 months. It is not a 12-year program. All my case managers are about to go, what are you saying? Sorry, it is a 12-month program. And so within that 12-month program, we have it broken up into 90-day segments to help them with their stabilization so that they can address substance use, so that they can start learning some of the life skills that they need to be able to live independently. So as they're going through that, one of the first things that happens with our intake director, and I'm sure Heather, you guys do this too, is you actually do a housing assessment so that you can get onto all the lists, so to speak, for the different housing vouchers that are out there. And so we do that assessment, and then we just start working that program so that within that 12-month time that they're in our transitional living program, when they're able to get the housing voucher or kind of whatever those next steps are, we're able to help move them into that next phase for them.
Thank you. And can you discuss a few of the barriers that victims experience when trying to find housing?
So let me just start with this. There's not a few barriers.
There's multiple.
There's mostly barriers. Like housing, which is the most important resource to access, is also the most difficult resource to access. And really it becomes because housing is expensive. It is, that's really what it comes down to, is that it is super expensive. And when you're working with somebody who does have that high level of trauma, it can be really challenging for them to be in a home and operate safely. And so then you have trouble with landlords. So housing is the barriers are huge and it's challenging to get through. So within that, what I would say in looking at those barriers, that there are three that I feel have to be addressed immediately for them to be successful in independent living when that comes. So the first thing is they have to address severe substance use. So as Morgan had talked about, they are often on methamphetamines, on heroin. And so when we look at those kinds of things, both of those types of substance use can be really destructive and can actually just kind of catapult you back into victimization. And so addressing those are part of the most important thing I would say to being able to live independently. So that's really why we base that. The second thing that we look at when we're looking at those barriers and what we need to address within that is we really look at addressing then your mental health disorders, mental health help. What is it that you need? And oftentimes that substance use and those behavioral health needs go hand in hand. So oftentimes they just kind of go down the street together like that. And so that's a huge piece of being able to be able to live independently. And then the third piece, honestly, comes with learning how to manage money so that you don't have to find alternate sources for funding, which then can, again, cause you to be victimized again. So those would be the three things that I would say are my top three when we look at the barriers that have to be overcome to be able to live independently successfully.
Yeah, and I agree with Shelly. I guess the only other one I would say is their background. If they've been in and out of this, these situations of trafficking and being re-trafficked multiple times, they more than likely have something on their background that could be a felony, a violent charge, a substance use, or paraphernalia charge. And so applying for an apartment through a corporate company is very hard. They're going to get denied 100% if something comes up on their background. So we kind of have to, again, use our resources and see, which landlords won't do a background check, but, really advocate on their part and making sure that, they're working with an organization who's going to be doing home visits, which are mandatory for our program, and making sure that, that they're able to generally just take care of the place. But again, building those rapport with our community is, something that we need to, I feel like a state can work on. But yeah, that would be the only other thing I would say is just the background.
Thank you. And I think, Shelly, you already addressed some of the things that your organization does to help work around those barriers. Is there anything you two would want to elaborate on?
I think in looking at that, one of the things that I really learned from Lifelink and their program was having compassion around those types of things. When we're looking at those barriers, to us, we look at them as barriers and like, okay, how are we going to be able to help them get through these things? But understanding that, at the end of the day, these are still people that are vulnerable. And if we can't have compassion for that and understanding about those types of needs and understanding that, addressing substance use is, we sit here in this room, we're like, address substance use. And that just seems so simple. It's not. It's super complicated. And knowing that kind of everything that we do is almost like a dance.
Yeah.
So, and not a rap dance, but you're kind of like, okay, we're going this way and that's working and now it's not. And now we're going this way and we're going to dance back this way. So in looking at all of it, it is definitely something where you kind of got 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. It's okay to take 2 steps back, but then another 2 steps forward. And so understanding that that's part of what the process is. And so it takes a long time. It's worth the effort. It's worth the effort.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we approach everything as harm reduction versus like, you got to stop right now or you can't work with us. It is really about, just getting that stability going and then working on the other issues that will come up. And then, realizing that these individuals, these are some of the coping skills that they've just had. This is the first time where they have somebody behind their back who's actually encouraging them to do better versus, this is the way their life is going to be for the rest. That's just it. So, yeah, I agree with Shelly.
Thank you. And you both mentioned backgrounds where victims have drug addictions. How do your organizations help victims as they try to navigate through that challenge?
So the Lifelink, again, is a behavioral health facility, but they also do substance abuse counseling. So when the client is ready, because they're not going to be ready right at that second when you want them to be, as much as you want them to be, it's case by case, and some of them are willing to work on their substance use. Some of them will, fight you till the end until it gets bad. But we offer substance abuse counseling, therapy. I know we have a clubhouse where they offer classes on skill building, and us, the way we help approach it is we kind of help them navigate in the community to find other alternatives, healthy alternatives, whether that's building a routine, and just kind of like being not their buddy but kind of their navigator and staying away from some of those places that they would associate with substance use. And then if they have ongoing cases that have to deal with substance use, we advocate on their behalf, and we'll go to court with them. We'll talk to their probation officers. We're there for them, with them through that process.
So for New Mexico Dream Center, we have not been around quite as long as the Lifelink, so we don't have a full behavioral health kind of spectrum of services like Lifelink does. We do have one clinician who focuses on trauma. So what that means for us is that we really look at community resources out there when we're looking for places to help our clients when they're working through substance use issues. And so here in Albuquerque, one of the things when they do come into program that we sit down and go through is what is your independent service plan? Like, what is it that you want to do? And then help them find those kinds of resources. And so our case managers have gone with many a client to different facilities and met with different like LDACs and just different programs to see what they think is going to be the best fit for them. And the other thing that we do also is we try to do some, we call it like neurobiology education around why these things are important or why you're feeling this way to help them understand themselves. Because when you're in a situation and you just feel like you're the only person in this situation, you're the only person that understands, hearing that that there's other people who've gone through this, or hearing that this is normal, it's okay, can really go a long way in, again, building that trust relationship, but then kind of giving them the stability or what they need to be able to take the next steps to address those kinds of issues.
Thank you. And Shelley, would you tell us more about what your organization does for AtRisk Youth?
Yeah,
how you work with them?
Absolutely. So the whole reason we started working with AtRisk Youth was because in 2017, I was providing direct services to survivors of human trafficking, and I had 3 young women in my program who were all between the ages of 19 and 23. All 3 of these women had been trafficked as unaccompanied homeless youth. We had one who'd been a runaway, and then 2 that had been kicked out of their homes. So they'd all been trafficked as homeless teens. They were all trafficked from the same freaking corner in Albuquerque, and they all had different traffickers. And so this really woke me up to what was happening on our streets when we're looking at young people who were experiencing homelessness. And so we started doing some research around that and started connecting with youth serving providers to see what actually is happening on the streets, and realized how vulnerable that population is. Even though we look at that and we say, oh, they're so vulnerable, these poor children, they don't want to be treated like they're vulnerable. They, have oftentimes been living on the streets or living that rough life since they were very young. And so we felt that having a resource that allowed them to make choices and allowed them to kind of do things in the way they wanted to do would be a good option. And so we were able to locate a facility off of East Central, which is kind of in the area where all of the good stuff or bad stuff, depending on which side of the law you're on. And so we found a facility and then opened up this drop-in center. So essentially, young people can come to the center. If they're under 21 years old, they can take showers, they can get food, they can meet with the case manager, get clothing hygiene, do their laundry, all of that kind of stuff. We say it's at-will services. They are not required to show us an ID when they get there. They can use their street name, any of those things. What we want them to have a safe place to be and feel like they can build trust. And after they've done that, they tend to want to go into services. So this is a different model than looking at something when you get sent to like a youth shelter and it's like, you're at a youth shelter, so this is what you have to do. And you don't have any agency in that. You just have to do what you're told. And so what this allows is for them to kind of determine on their own time frame how they want to address things. What we've seen is it generally takes about 7 to 9 visits for a young person to decide they really want to start looking for services. And the first thing that we find that they all need is their ID, because when they're out there on the street, either they've been kicked out and they've never had an ID or it's been stolen from them. And so those vital docs are almost always the very first thing that happens.
And would you like to tell us more, Heather, if your organization does a lot of work with at-risk youth, what you do?
I wish we did, but we don't, because there's a real need for working with at-risk youth. We do get referrals for them, but unfortunately, the Lifelink will only work with individuals 18 and older. I know we're really trying to change the model, but it's really hard. But I mean, I praise Shelly because her group does a really good job about outreaching, and I think that's what we need to see more of, is outreaching the youth, because there's not a lot of resources for them. There's it's either detention or the streets. Like, there's really no option for them, or sending them out of state, which is not what we want to do, because technically, if you look at that, it's still considered like trafficking.
Yeah, there's so many. Don't even get me started with
And
that.
being an at-risk youth myself, when I was growing up, I got shifted all over the state. Like, I went from Grant to Gallup to Las Cruces to Santa Fe, back to Las Cruces, and nobody really wasn't telling me what was going on. So, like, having an advocate with you that can, speak on your behalf because you're a minor, is something that's really needed in our state, and more programs like Shelly to really outreach the youth here.
And Morgan, in the operations that HSI does, when you come across victims of human trafficking or minors, what are you doing? What things do you do?
So, and also just to piggyback on something that Shelly said before, the identification documents is a problem throughout human trafficking survivors, not just juveniles. They very rarely have any kind of documents. They're either lost them long ago. Sometimes the trafficker will hold them as kind of hostage. But if you think about how little you can actually do without a driver's license or a social security card, both of these groups are like experts at getting people identification documents, birth certificates, driver's licenses, social security cards. That's a really big part. And I know we just touched on it, but it's very important to get them going further into services they're talking about, because things like housing, a bank account, owning a car. If you think about some of these basic things that we all do in life, you can't do it without these documents. So that's important. But as far as minors, we luckily have come across relatively few minors in our investigations. I don't know if that's an indication of that there's less in New Mexico, or that we're doing a bad job at outreaching to them. But so HSI is a federal agency. It's not a state or a local agency. So we have no custodial decision-making powers as a federal agency for juveniles, for minors. So what we will do is we will do our normal interview that we do, make sure that the child is safe. The kids that we've seen have typically been between 15 and 17. We see very few below 15. Even 15 is very young. They all seem to be 16 and 17. We try to figure out their basic needs, kind of like what we do with everybody else. but ultimately, we end up calling CYFD, the Children, Youth, and Family Department, and they will respond, and they'll take custody of the child and figure out what to do with them. There have been some very limited circumstances where a youth ends up being like important in a case. We've had this happen, I think, twice, where we've taken a more active role in like long-term housing, because there's very little. There might be none long-term stuff for youth in New Mexico. So we've had to send kids up to Colorado. There's a facility up by Colorado Springs that we've used, and some other places. And then we'll get back involved kind of when that's needed. But our thing is like just kind of treat them like anybody else, and then we call CYFD and kind of let them handle it.
Thank you, Morgan. And all of you can discuss some more about the difficulties of finding housing for victims who are minors. Morgan just touched on it a little bit.
I've got lots to say. If you don't
Yeah,
have anything. We've got lots to say.
the way we can house minors is if they have a relative, like a grandparent or an aunt or uncle that's not a threat to the individual, to the minor. Then we're able to house them that way. But we can't just house one minor. It's kind of against the law. But and then if we have somebody who's about to age into being 18, like say we have a 17-year-old and their birthday is like a week away or so, then we can work with CYFD on those cases. But other than that, that's the only barrier that we have housing minors, is if they're unaccompanied.
Yeah, so there's a lot of trouble when you look at trying to house minors. Like Heather said, like you can't just take a 15-year-old and go, okay, here's your apartment. Like that's not going to happen. And so what we have to then look at is that we have a system within New Mexico that is not able to help these kids in the way that they need to be helped. So I think, as when Morgan was saying, they haven't run into a lot with the way that they've done their kind of operations and those types of things. When you look at what's happening with minors, the picture looks a little bit different. And so when you're looking for outreach or you're looking to try to figure out how you can provide services, then basically what ends up happening is you get super involved in the child welfare system here in New Mexico. And so, and that's just layers and layers and layers of craziness within there. So just a couple of things that I just want to say about it. Sorry, I have so many things. But a couple of things that we need to know, or that I think everybody needs to know. When you look at the national landscape for what's happening with youth who have been trafficked, minors who've been trafficked, it's important to understand that like 60% of those young people that enter into some form of commercial sexual exploitation do so through any of the child welfare agencies across the United States. So we need to look at our foster care system. Heather talked about being an at-risk youth, and she talked about how she was bounced from grants to Las Cruces to all of these different kinds of places. And so when we've got a kid who is already in child welfare because of the crappy stuff that's happened in their family or in their life, you've got a kid who's already traumatized right there. And then they come into services that are not trauma informed and they get bounced from place to place to place. And what you're further doing is you're severing any of those kinds of connections that they might have to people that can help them. And when that happens, that trafficker is more able to access them and is more able to exploit them because all of those important relationships have been severed so many times that this young person just doesn't even understand what to do or where to go next. And so if we look at really wanting to address domestic minor sex trafficking, so that's the fancy word for the trafficking of children who were born in the United States, we have to look at these kind of push-pull factors that go into the exploitation of these young people. So we need to look at our child welfare system and how it contributes to that. The other thing that I'm going to say, since I'm on my soapbox right now, is that New Mexico is one of 5 states that does not have residential programming for minors who have been trafficked. So 45 other states have figured it out, and we're still working on that. And so for New Mexico Dream Center, we're also working on that and are hoping to have a facility licensed by the end of the year. And so we see that as a huge need for these young people. So we're working on that, but we need to really look at a complete system overhaul if we're going to care for these children the way that they need to be cared for, so that they don't end up as basically trafficking victims who are just ready for the trafficker to walk in. Okay, I will come off my soapbox.
Thanks so much, Shelley. We appreciate all of you talking about the importance of helping children who are being trafficked. We're curious about how the recent pandemic affected housing victims. Did you experience challenges during it?
We sure did.
So many challenges. In an already challenging aspect of providing services, then that was another big one. Go ahead, Blake.
Right. So when applying for housing, that in itself was probably the biggest barrier, because you can't, they shut everything down. Everything was virtual. But if you don't have access to a computer or even a phone to where you can see, what you might be living into, and then like getting there and it's not really what you saw online is, one of the biggest things that we faced, because we weren't allowed to go in person. And, it disassociates, and isolates individuals more because they can't go nowhere. And so I think that was the biggest barrier. And then you get discouraged, from the application process, because it takes a lot longer than just, being able to fill it out, get a fee if there's one, and then going and taking it in. And then, somebody calls you back the next day or two, and then you're able to go see the unit, and it's, it is what it is, versus being online and having to jump through the hoops. And if you don't have like the documentation to fill in one of the little boxes, you can't really proceed on getting the application done. So there were multiple barriers that we faced. And then just location was a big one. Santa Fe County has very little housing that's affordable. So, we kind of had to really look to see what we could find in that area. Albuquerque wasn't too bad, but it's also, a lot of slumlords out there that were really, advertising a lot of different properties that, again, were either not appropriate, the location wasn't appropriate, or, again, that background. So there was multiple things that we ran into. But again, really like advocating on behalf of the client and making sure that you're able to get them somewhere stable and safe was, our top priority. So we really had to really work the system.
I think the other thing, which kind of with what you're saying is, and I don't know if you saw this in Santa Fe, is one, there weren't a lot of apartments. Like, it was suddenly a shortage. And so you would have like 60 people, and I say that completely seriously, 60 people all applying for one apartment, which was a crappy apartment that nobody should live in. So when you're looking at that was something that was really, really difficult. And then with that, because of the kind of those changes that came because of the pandemic, the prices skyrocketed. So before, when you would have an apartment and you're at the, $700-ish a month range, suddenly, went up to over $1,000 a month.
Yeah.
And it is not worth $1,000 a month. Nobody should ever pay that much for that type of an apartment. And so the challenge that went with that is that the vouchers you work with don't change their value in as quick of a time frame as landlords. So landlord could go, oh yeah, look at that, the market's changing. I can, give you a 30-day notice and raise the rate, hundreds of dollars. But then when you're looking in the voucher system, that's a whole act of the state of New Mexico.
Yeah.
It's not, but within the housing authority. And so so what we saw was just trying to find even a place to go, and then just saw a huge increase in price.
Yeah, and the only alternative that we found was sticking people in hotel rooms, which is kind of defeating the purpose of stabilizing them, because they're back in that same setting that they were used to while they were being trafficked. So, retriggering them, and then again isolating them was the big barrier that we had seen as far as their mental health was. And then again came the substance abuse. So when you're using at a hotel room, you have a higher risk of being kicked out because there's traffic going through there. So yeah, pandemic was a tough one.
We also saw from the law enforcement side that, particularly before the vaccine was developed, the people left doing sex work were the most desperate, the most with no other options. People that couldn't go to like the webcam, like a lot of the women turned to webcamming, but the ones that don't have a computer, that don't have Wi-Fi, that don't those were the ones that you saw the remaining. So you're dealing with the most desperate, the most vulnerable, the most susceptible to traffickers because they truly have nowhere else to go, and that's what we saw. Like I said, at the kind of the worst part of it, when there was no vaccine, there was a lot of uncertainty about what would happen if you got COVID. So we saw that.
And do you still face some of these challenges, or have they kind of stabilized as things have improved?
I think that we still face some of those challenges,
Well, it
especially.
Kind of fluctuates.
It does. It fluctuates. I know it's easier to find an apartment right now, but it's still super expensive. So there's just kind of like looking at this as a new norm is kind of the way that you have to look at it with that.
Yeah, housing is still very limited. It's again trying to work those loopholes and stuff. But just housing in general is just so low right now in the state of New Mexico, and if you don't have transportation or a means to go and see these properties, it's very hard to get in anywhere. And if you're applying for an apartment through again a corporate entity, it's the wait lists are months out, and you're trying to get somebody in pretty quick, and nobody's going to wait 2 or 3 months. You're trying to get into an apartment, so you just got to keep looking. Again, try to advocate on behalf of the individual, but I think housing is always just going to be a big barrier anywhere.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end of our time, and I want to get to some of the questions that we have from the audience. So we're going to address those really quick. One of them was asking about the homeless camps that in Albuquerque are very prevalent. Are many people there previous victims of human trafficking, or are they even continue to be trafficked?
So they can be, when you look at a homeless camp and you look at that kind of population of especially chronic homeless people, they all have to survive some way. And we are an economy that will use cash or will use bartering. And so what we've seen kind of with homeless camps is that they can absolutely be something where people will sell sex to be able to have, to be in the tent, or this is kind of where you go and pick people up. So it's it can definitely happen and does happen. I don't know that it's exclusively happening within the kind of tent communities that we see out there. We see when we do outreach with kind of in those sections, we see a lot of violence. So there's a lot of violence against women, against each other within that. And I think a lot of that does come down to, so much drug use out there that people, there's tends to be a lot of violence there. But I can't say that just because there's a homeless camp that means that there's trafficking happening there.
And what can your organizations do to help with the emancipation process? Do your organizations do anything at all with that?
Well, I think you should talk about what is it called, Morgan? When you can stay in the United States while your case is being worked. I just can't.
Is that what you're asking about? Emancipation is.
Oh, are you talking about? Sorry.
It's going back to minors.
The youth.
Oh, emancipation. I'm so sorry. My brain jumped to immigration. I didn't even hear. I'm like continued presence. That's what I was thinking. You were sorry.
Right away. It's all right.
Okay, so emancipation. So emancipation is a really complex and challenging kind of situation to go through. So ideally, you could look at the emancipation process and go, yeah, that could be a way that a young person could have agency. To be able to be emancipated, though, is that you do have to show, one, that you have income and that you can continue to have that kind of income to be able to care for yourself. If you can't show that, then you're automatically going to be disqualified from emancipation. And then the other thing that goes with that is that you have the maturity level to be able to live independently. And so when we look at emancipation, we really look at that as not being something that most people are going to go through. And very few actually do that successfully. So instead, what we look at is for a young person to be able to, through child welfare, if they're in that kind of system, work with CYFD and the judge in being able to have their own agency and be able to make some decisions about their own care within that kind of ethos, and as opposed to just pure emancipation.
We've also seen, Jordan, a real lack of legal aid services for people that can't afford legal aid. So the few that are in Albuquerque and in Mexico, the wait list is just enormous to get like a case through. So, like taking advantage of like what Shelley's talking about, the emancipation, but also the expungement of certain felony law. It's a very difficult process without an attorney, and then there are people that don't have access to attorneys. So that's also been a problem.
Thank you both. Morgan, I think this question is more for you. Someone's asking if you've encountered trafficking cases that have involved religious cults, or to a certain extent, or maybe any of you have experience with that.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe 5 to 7 years ago, we did participate in a case of the, I don't want to use the word cult, but a religious group out in Fence Lake, New Mexico, which is kind of like west of Grants, I think a little bit west of Grants, and they were labor trafficking is what they were doing. So they were basically, people were living on it was like a compound, and they were being forced to do door-to-door sales, and they had a quota, and certain things would happen to them if they didn't meet the quota, or they would be worked harder, and there was like a debt bondage segment or element to it. So several people did end up getting prosecuted on a state level out of that case, but that's been the only sort of like verified or corroborated instance that we've seen. But we do get occasional leads in regarding religious organizations. Again, I don't want to use the word cult, but that's the only one that's actually led to kind of a case.
All right, I know of one, I actually know of a couple of ones that FBI and Homeland Security are doing out of California and a couple different other areas. Very similar to what you were saying, Morgan.
Yeah, and the door-to-door sales thing is kind of like a common labor trafficking scheme. We see it with other, not just religious, but we see it with certain ethnicities. We've seen it with like Israelis fairly, frequently in the Albuquerque area. There's talk about it. These magazine salespeople that go around. But again, the only one that we've seen that's been verified is this one out in Fence Lake that was actually labor trafficking people.
Well, and I think when you think about the concept of like cult and human trafficking, I don't think that you just need to look at like this religious aspect. I think any sort of group that is controlling another group of people can be, thought of trafficking. So it doesn't have to necessarily be religious. I mean, it could be, but this is like what gang trafficking is. So like when you're looking at a gang, well, they're acting as that as well within that.
Yeah, it's more of I personally, I think that the religious cult trafficking is like a media construct that makes good TV shows and movies, but it's not necessarily.
Well, and the only cult trafficking that I've really heard of, and honestly, they went through was with that whole Nexium thing that was in New York State, and that was, and And that was considered a cult, which at the time it looked like it was a business, but then it was considered a cult, and then there were women that were trafficked through that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, a cult even can be just a trafficker, your run-of-the-mill pimp trafficker who has 3 to 5 women that he controls. And a lot of that, if you see, that operates very similar to what would be known as like a cult in the media.
Thank you both. And we're just about at the end of our time. So I want to ask all of you, what can the public do to assist your organizations and Morgan assist your investigations too?
I would say get away from some of the stereotypes of what human trafficking is. It's not 10-year-old Chinese or Vietnamese girls, in the cargo hold of a ship. It's people right in our community, people that we probably see pass by when we go to Walmart or go to Smith's that are American citizens or U.S. citizens that are being exploited, and that we just don't pay a lot of attention to. I think the media in a lot of ways doesn't make things, doesn't make things better. I think in a lot of ways law enforcement also doesn't understand what it is it's dealing with. So I just ask people to be more aware of what it really is and to be more compassionate and more, better understand the people that it's happening to.
And I agree with that. I think awareness is a huge, huge thing. So I think that's something that people need to understand. The other thing that I'm just going to do, that I'm just going to jump on because,
But you can.
because I can,
Yeah.
is that, there's demand for this. So let's look at that. So maybe you shouldn't be trying to find somebody to buy sex from. Let's just go with that right there. And so I think looking at demand is a really big piece of this. And so if you're looking at how can we get on top of these kinds of things, how can we get in front, I should say, of this kind of stuff, is going, what are we going to as society continue to allow or not allow when it comes to demand?
Yeah, and I would just say, I have a almost 12-year-old, and she likes to game. She's a gamer, so keep an eye on your kids. Educate them about what's out there on the internet. Let them know. Don't ever give your info out. Don't ever tell them, where you're at. I'm always getting on her for it.
And don't send pics.
And don't
Doesn't
send
matter.
pictures. Yep. And just be adamant about safety. I think.
Even like Facebook photos and things like that, the about section of Facebook.
Yep.
Watch your security settings. Don't make it open to everybody.
Stay away from Snapchat.
Thank you. And would any of you like to offer some closing thoughts as we wrap up?
Just thank you, Jordan, for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. We really appreciate your time, and more importantly, we appreciate the work that you do. It's important work, and I'll put in later today the contact information for your organizations on our website so that the viewers can go to your websites and see more about what you do and hopefully help you all out too. We want to thank you also for joining us today, our attendees, whether you're joining us via the webinar or on Facebook or YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will be back tomorrow starting at 12 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And tomorrow we will hear from victim advocates from the police department and the district attorney's office and how they help victims. Again, Morgan, Shelley, and Heather, thank you so much for joining us today. Stay safe, and thank you again for all that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And